On the night of February 13th, 2000, the Degree household in Shelby, North Carolina, followed the same quiet routine it always had. It was a modest home on Oakcrest Drive, the kind of place where schedules were predictable and nights ended early. Harold and Aquila Degree were strict but attentive parents. Their children, Asha and her older brother O'Brien, were raised with structure, discipline, and clear rules about safety and responsibility. Nothing about that Sunday evening suggested it would end differently from countless nights before it. Asha Degree was 9 years old. She was shy, polite, and deeply attached to her family. Teachers described her as quiet but conscientious. She followed rules closely and rarely acted impulsively. She was not known to lie, sneak out, or disobey instructions. Her parents had raised her to be cautious, especially around strangers, and those lessons had clearly taken hold. Asha was not the kind of child anyone would expect to leave home alone in the middle of the night. That evening, the family watched television together before preparing for bed. School was scheduled for the next day. Asha had recently participated in a basketball game that did not go well, and some later speculated whether disappointment might have weighed on her. But nothing about her behavior that night indicated distress or conflict. There were no arguments, no punishments, no emotional outbursts. When bedtime came, it arrived as it always did. Asha shared a bedroom with her brother. The two siblings went to sleep in their respective beds, separated by just a few feet. Their parents checked on them before turning in for the night. The house settled into silence as a storm moved through the area. Heavy rain fell steadily. Wind rattled against the structure. Temperatures dropped unusually low for North Carolina, creating cold, damp conditions outside. Sometime after midnight, the storm intensified. Power flickered briefly but did not fail. Inside the house, everyone appeared to be asleep. At approximately 2:30 a.m., however, something changed. For reasons still unknown, Asha quietly got out of bed. She did so carefully, without waking her brother. She dressed herself in a white long-sleeved shirt, light-colored pants, and sneakers. She gathered a small backpack and placed items inside. Then, without leaving a note, without waking anyone, and without triggering alarm, she walked out the front door. The Degree home showed no signs of disturbance. Doors were locked, windows were intact. There was no evidence of struggle, coercion, or intrusion. Everything suggested that Asha left on her own. What makes this moment so unsettling is not only that she left, but how she left. Children who run away typically act out of emotion, fear, anger, or desperation. They often leave during the day. They often take money, food, or clothing. Asha did none of these things. She left in the early morning hours, during a storm, carrying only what fit inside her. Small backpack. She did not dress for warmth. She did not pack supplies for survival. She left behind belongings of sentimental value. Shortly after leaving her home, Asha turned onto Highway 18, a two-lane road that runs south of Shelby. At around 3:30 a.m., she was seen by multiple motorists walking along the shoulder of the highway. These sightings would later become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Witnesses described a small child walking alone in the darkness, rain falling around her. She was not hitchhiking. She was not crying or waving for help. She walked with her head down, moving steadily forward as if she knew where she was going. The consistency of these reports coming from different drivers who did not know one another gave them strong credibility. One motorist, alarmed by the sight, turned his vehicle around to check on her. When his headlights illuminated Asha, she reacted not with relief, but with fear. She ran off the road and disappeared into the wooded area beside the highway. This reaction deeply unsettled investigators. Children in danger typically seek help from adults. Asha did the opposite. She avoided assistance, suggesting she believed she was not supposed to be seen or stopped. This moment marked the last confirmed sighting of Asha Degree. Sometime after she entered the woods, her trail vanished. No footprints were found. No items were recovered. Tracking dogs were later brought in, but heavy rain had washed away potential scent trails. At one point, dogs reportedly picked up her scent near a shed along the road before losing it entirely, raising early questions about whether she may have entered a vehicle. Morning came without incident inside the Degree household. At around 6:30 a.m., Harold and Aquila woke their children for school. O'Brien was present. Asha was not. At first, confusion replaced concern. Parents often assume a child may have moved to another room or woken early. As minutos passed, worry set in. The house was searched. Closets were checked. Bathrooms were opened. Asha was nowhere to be found. Panic followed quickly. Family members were contacted. Neighbors were alerted. Law enforcement was called. Within hours, the situation escalated into a full missing child investigation. Officers arrived at the home, searching the property and interviewing the family. The storm complicated early efforts, washing away potential evidence and limiting visibility. From the very beginning, investigators were struck by the lack of a clear explanation. Asha had not been taken by force. She had not left during daylight. She had not behaved in a way that aligned with fear or rebellion. Everything pointed to a deliberate decision made by a child who believed she had a reason to leave. As news spread through Shelby, shock rippled through the community. Parents kept children home from school. Neighbors joined search efforts. Volunteers combed nearby woods, fields, and roadside areas. Helicopters were deployed. Search teams worked around the clock, calling Asha's name into the darkness. Nothing was found. No clothing, no backpack, no signs of struggle. The woods where she had last been seen yielded no answers. It was as if Asha had stepped out of one world and vanished into another. Investigators began asking the question that would define the case from that point forward. Not simply where Asha went, but why she left in the first place. That question carried an uncomfortable implication. It suggested that the key to understanding the disappearance did not lie in the woods or along the highway, but in something that happened before she ever walked out the door. Asha Degree did not run from danger. She walked towards something, and whatever she believed awaited her that night would shape one of the most enduring mysteries in modern American history. By the time law enforcement arrived at the Degree home on the morning of February 14, 2000, it was already clear that this was not a typical missing child case. Officers from the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office approached the situation with urgency, but also with confusion. The facts they were presented with did not align with the patterns they were trained to recognize. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, no evidence that anyone else had been inside the home during the night. Everything suggested that Asha Degree had left on her own. Investigators began with the most immediate task, establishing a timeline. Harold and Aquila Degree were interviewed separately and together. Their accounts were consistent. They had gone to bed around 12:30 a.m. after checking on both children. Neither parent heard anything unusual during the night. O'Brien, who shared a bedroom with Asha, slept through the night and did not realize she was gone until morning. This detail was unsettling. Asha had managed to get dressed, pack a backpack, and leave the house without waking anyone. Officers searched the home thoroughly. They examined doors and windows. Everything was intact. The front door had been locked, But investigators believed Asha knew how to unlock it quietly. There were no alarms, no security cameras. No neighbors reported hearing anything during the night. The storm had masked any sounds that might otherwise have drawn attention. Outside, the search expanded quickly. Law enforcement canvassed the immediate neighborhood, knocking on doors and speaking with residents. No one reported seeing Asha leave her home. No one reported unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious activity on Oakcrest Drive during the night. This absence of witnesses reinforced the belief that Asha left quietly and intentionally. Within hours, search teams began combing areas along Highway 18, focusing on the stretch where motorists had reported seeing a child walking alone in the early morning hours. Those witness statements were critical. Multiple drivers independently described a small girl matching Asha's appearance walking south along the road between approximately 3:30 and 4:15 a.m. Their descriptions were consistent clothing, size, and behavior. This was not a single mistaken sighting. It was a pattern. Searchers moved into the wooded area where Asha was last seen running from the road. Volunteers, deputies, and later trained search and rescue teams worked in coordinated grids. Tracking dogs were deployed, but the heavy rain from the storm severely limited their effectiveness. Water had washed away footprints and scent trails, erasing what might have been the most valuable physical evidence in the case. Despite these challenges, dogs did pick up a partial scent near a shed located along the highway. This discovery immediately raised questions. Why would Asha's scent stop there? Investigators considered the possibility that she had entered a vehicle at that location, voluntarily or otherwise. However, no physical evidence supported this theory at the time. No tire tracks were identified. No witnesses reported a vehicle stopping. It remained a possibility, not a conclusion. As the day progressed, the scale of the search grew. Helicopters were brought in to scan from above. Creeks, ditches, and culverts were examined. Fields were walked. Woods were searched repeatedly. Volunteers called Asha's name for hours, hoping for a response. None came. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives faced a growing sense of unease. Missing children cases often present early indicators family conflict, signs of abuse, or evidence of abduction. Asha's case offered none of these. Her parents were cooperative, emotional, and consistent. Teachers described her as responsible and well-adjusted. Friends did not recall any unusual behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Investigators examined Asha's room closely. They searched for notes, drawings, or hidden messages. Nothing suggested she planned to leave permanently. She did not take money. She did not take warm clothing. She did not pack food. She left behind items of comfort and sentimental value. These facts contradicted the idea of a runaway. The question of motive became increasingly troubling. Why would a child like Asha leave home under such conditions? Detectives considered whether she might have been upset over a recent basketball game, but those who knew her did not believe disappointment alone would drive such behavior. Others wondered whether Valentine's Day, which fell that morning, held some significance for her. But again, no evidence supported a clear connection. By late afternoon, the case had drawn media attention. Local news stations reported on the disappearance, broadcasting Asha's photo and asking the public for help. Tips began to come in almost immediately. Some were vague, others were well-intentioned but unhelpful. Each one had to be logged, evaluated, and either pursued or ruled out. As night fell, search efforts continued under floodlights. The emotional toll was visible. Volunteers were exhausted. Family members clung to hope. Investigators pressed on, aware that the first 24 hours were critical. Yet, as those hours passed, the reality set in that Asha had not been found near her last known location. Internally, detectives began to consider possibilities they were reluctant to voice publicly. The idea that Asha had been influenced rather than forced started to take shape. Her calm demeanor, her purposeful walking, her decision to avoid help. These details suggested she believed she was doing what she was supposed to do. This interpretation marked a turning point in how investigators viewed the case. If Asha believed she was meant to leave, then the focus needed to shift away from physical force and toward psychological influence. Someone may have gained her trust. Someone may have convinced her that leaving in the middle of the night was necessary or expected. That possibility was deeply unsettling. It implied planning. It implied familiarity. And it implied that the person responsible did not need to chase or threaten a child. They only needed her to believe them. As the second day of searching yielded no results, law enforcement began expanding the scope of the investigation. Nearby towns were alerted. State agencies were notified. Asha's photo was distributed more widely. The case transitioned from a localized search to a broader missing child investigation. For the Degree family, the waiting became unbearable. Every phone call raised hope. Every passing hour without news deepened the fear. Yet they remained visible, cooperating with investigators and speaking with media, determined to bring their daughter home. By the end of the second day, one thing was clear to everyone involved. This was not a case that would resolve quickly. There were no easy explanations, no clear suspects, no physical trail to follow. Asha Degree had vanished under circumstances that defied logic and expectation. The stormy had erased evidence. Time was slipping away. And the most important questions remained unanswered. Why did she leave? Who, if anyone, knew she would? And what happened after she disappeared into the darkness? Those questions would define the investigation moving forward, shaping every decision, every theory, and every appeal for years to come. As investigators moved deeper into the first days of the search for Asha Degree, the case began to crystallize around one narrow stretch of road. Highway 18. A quiet two-lane highway south of Shelby became the focal point of the investigation. It was here, in the early morning darkness, that Asha had last been seen. Everything known about her movements after leaving home pointed toward this road, and every unanswered question seemed to radiate outward from it. The witness sightings along Highway 18 were unusual not only because they existed, but because of how consistent they were. Multiple motorists, traveling independently, reported seeing a small child walking alone along the roadside between approximately 3:30 and 4:15 a.m. These were not vague impressions or second-hand accounts. Drivers described specific details. A young girl wearing light-colored clothing, carrying a backpack, walking with her head down in the rain. Investigators treated these statements with seriousness. In missing persons cases, eyewitness reports can be unreliable, especially when they come from a single source. But in this case, the similarities across multiple accounts strengthened their credibility. The witnesses did not know one another. They contacted law enforcement separately, and they described the same unsettling image: a child alone in the storm. One driver's account stood out in particular. Troubled by what he was seeing, he turned his vehicle around to get a closer look. When his headlights illuminated the girl, she reacted immediately. Instead of approaching the car or signaling for help, she ran. She left the shoulder of the road and disappeared into the wooded area beside the highway. That reaction would become one of the most analyzed details in the entire case. Children who are lost, injured, or afraid typically respond to adult assistance with relief. Asha did not. Her response suggested fear, but not panic. It suggested avoidance. Investigators interpreted this behavior as evidence that Asha believed she should not be seen or that she had been instructed not to interact with strangers. This detail aligned with what her parents had taught her: never accept help from unknown adults. What troubled investigators was the implication behind that logic. If Asha avoided strangers, then whoever she ultimately encountered may not have felt like one to her. After Asha ran into the woods, her trail effectively ended. Search teams focused intensely on that area. Volunteers and deputies searched on foot, calling her name repeatedly. The woods were thick, uneven, and soaked from the storm. Visibility was poor. Despite hours of searching, nothing was found. No clothing, no backpack, no sign that a child had been there. Tracking dogs were brought in, but the storm had severely compromised their effectiveness. Rain washes away scent quickly, and the ground conditions made it difficult to follow any trail with confidence. At one point, dogs appeared to pick up a scent near a shed along the highway. This location immediately drew attention. The shed was close enough to the road to suggest a possible transition point. Investigators considered whether Asha may have entered the shed for shelter, or whether it represented the place where she encountered someone else. The possibility that she had entered a vehicle near that location began to take shape. However, there was no direct evidence to confirm this. No witnesses reported seeing a car stop. No tire marks were identified. The shed became a point of speculation rather than confirmation. As search efforts continued, law enforcement began reconstructing Asha's likely path. Based on witness statements, she appeared to be walking south, away from her home. This direction did not align with any obvious destination. There were no friends' houses nearby, no relatives, no places a child would normally go at that hour. This raised another critical question. Where did Asha think she was going? Investigators examined maps, distances, and landmarks along the route. They looked for locations that might hold significance to child churches, schools, stores, but nothing obvious emerged. The absence of a clear destination reinforced the idea that Asha's purpose may not have been tied to a physical location she understood fully, but rather to an expectation or instruction. As daylight faded into the second night of searching, frustration set in. Search teams had covered miles of terrain with no results. Volunteers were exhausted. Family members were emotionally drained. Investigators faced the reality that the longer Asha remained missing, the less likely it was that she would be found nearby. Internally, the case began to shift. The early assumption that Asha might still be in the area gave way to the possibility that she had been moved. This was a difficult conclusion to accept, but the evidence or lack thereof pointed in that direction. If Asha had remained in the woods, something should have been found. The complete absence of physical trace suggested otherwise. The idea that Asha had entered a vehicle became more prominent. But again, this raised unsettling implications. If she entered a vehicle willingly, then whoever was inside did not need to force her. They needed only to appear trustworthy or familiar. That possibility changed the nature of the investigation entirely. Detectives began considering scenarios involving influence rather than abduction. They explored whether Asha could have been communicating with someone outside her family. They reviewed her school environment, church activities, and neighborhood interactions. Anyone who had regular contact with her was quietly examined. Despite these efforts, no clear suspect emerged. There were no reports of suspicious adults approaching children in the area. No known offenders living nearby. No obvious red flags in Asha's daily life. Each avenue of inquiry ended the same way, with uncertainty. Public reaction to the witness sightings was intense. Many people were disturbed by the idea that drivers had seen Asha and not been able to help her. Law enforcement was careful to clarify that the witnesses had acted reasonably under confusing circumstances. Seeing a child walking alone in the rain at 4 a.m. was so unexpected that many initially doubted their own perception. As days past, the search transitioned into investigation. Search grids were scaled back. Command posts were dismantled. The focus moved from physical terrain to information. Tips were reviewed. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Timelines were refined. The image of Asha walking alone on Highway 18 became the defining visual of the case. It represented the moment when she was still alive, still making choices, still within reach. Everything after that moment existed in shadow. Investigators understood that whatever happened next likely happened quickly. The window between Asha entering the woods and disappearing entirely was narrow. That window, they believed, held the answers. But without physical evidence, without witnesses beyond the highway, and without a clear destination, the case stalled. The road had given up what it could. The woods had yielded nothing, and the truth remained hidden beyond the last place Asha was seen. The highway, once a simple stretch of asphalt, became a symbol of the case itself. A place of transition, a boundary between what was known and what was lost. And somewhere beyond that boundary, the story of Asha Degree continued unseen, unheard, and unresolved. For more than a year after Asha Degree vanished, the investigation remained trapped. In uncertainty, search efforts had ended. Leads had grown thin. Investigators revisited the same facts repeatedly, hoping a new interpretation might reveal what had been missed. The case had not gone cold, but it had entered a familiar and frustrating phase where progress depended almost entirely on information that had not yet surfaced. Then, in August 2001, something unexpected happened. Nearly 18 months after Asha disappeared, a construction worker was clearing land along a rural stretch of Highway 18 in Burke County, North Carolina, approximately 30 miles north of Shelby. While operating heavy equipment near a roadside area, he noticed a black plastic trash bag partially buried in the ground. At first glance, it looked like debris. But something about the way it was wrapped and concealed stood out. He stopped work and contacted authorities. When law enforcement arrived and carefully opened the bag, they found a child's backpack inside. It belonged to Asha Degree. The discovery immediately altered the direction of the case. Until that moment, investigators had been forced to consider the possibility, however, unlikely that Asha had wandered into the woods and succumbed to the elements. The backpack eliminated that theory. A child could not have carried it 30 miles away and buried it. Someone else had been involved. The location of the backpack was significant. Burke County was well outside the original search area. There was no logical reason for Asha to go there. The fact that the bag had been buried suggested intent. It had not been dropped accidentally. It had not been discarded hastily. Someone had taken deliberate steps to hide it. Equally important was the condition of the backpack. Despite being buried, it was relatively well preserved. Investigators noted that it appeared to have been protected from prolonged exposure to the elements. This raised an unsettling possibility. The backpack may not have been buried immediately after Asha disappeared. It could have been kept somewhere else indoors, or in a vehicle for some time before being disposed of. Inside the backpack were items that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Some belongings were consistent with what Asha might have packed herself, but others were not. Among the items was a children's book from her elementary school library. Records later showed that the book had not been checked out. How it ended up in Asha's possession was unclear. Even more puzzling was a New Kids on the Block concert t-shirt. The shirt did not belong to Asha. Her family stated unequivocally that it was not hers, and that she had never owned one like it. The shirt did not match her size or known interests. Investigators attempted to trace its origin, but it could not be definitively linked to a specific owner. The presence of these items raised immediate questions. Who put them in the backpack? Were they added before Asha left home or afterward? If they were added later, it meant someone else had access to her belongings. That conclusion carried profound implications. Investigators revisited the entire timeline with this new information. If Asha had entered a vehicle that night, it would explain both the sudden loss of her trail near Highway 18 and the distance between her home and the backpack's location. The idea that she had encountered someone became no longer speculative, but necessary to explain the evidence. Law enforcement also considered whether the backpack's burial site held additional significance. The area was not random wilderness. It was near a roadway, but not visible from it. Someone familiar with the area could have chosen the spot intentionally. This suggested local knowledge, or at least deliberate planning. Public reaction to the discovery was intense. Media coverage surged. Headlines announced that Asha's backpack had been found. For many, it was the first tangible piece of evidence in a case defined by absence. But the relief of discovery was quickly replaced by dread. The backpack did not answer what happened to Asha. It confirmed that someone else had been involved, and that they had taken steps to hide the truth. For Asha's family, the moment was devastating and clarifying all at once. The discovery ended certain hopes, but it also validated long-held fears. Their daughter had not simply vanished on her own. Someone had interfered. Someone had taken control of the situation. Investigators now faced a new challenge. Instead of searching for a missing child, they were attempting to reconstruct events that had been deliberately concealed. The focus shifted from location to behavior. What kind of person would bury a child's backpack? Why keep it at all? Why place unfamiliar items inside? These questions suggested that the backpack was not merely discarded evidence, but part of a larger sequence of decisions. Someone had possession of it. Someone chose what went inside. Someone chose where and how it would be. Hidden. Despite advances in forensic science, the backpack yielded limited physical evidence. DNA testing was conducted, but results were inconclusive. Environmental exposure and time had degraded much of the material. Still, the backpack became the most important physical artifact in the case. It was re-examined repeatedly as technology improved. The discovery also changed how investigators viewed the early witness sightings. The theory that Asha had entered a vehicle gained credibility. The scent trail near the shed along Highway 18 was reinterpreted as a possible transfer point. What had once been speculation now fit a broader narrative. However, this narrative still lacked a central figure. No suspect emerged. No vehicle was identified. No one came forward claiming knowledge of the backpack or its contents. The case remained unresolved, but now it was defined by concealment rather than disappearance. As months passed after the discovery, investigators pursued new leads generated. By renewed media attention, tips poured in once again. Some were vague, others contradicted known facts. Each had to be evaluated carefully. The backpack's existence provided a benchmark against which new information could be tested. Internally, detectives acknowledged that the discovery represented both progress and limitation. It confirmed outside involvement, but it did not identify who was responsible or what ultimately happened to Asha. The most important questions remained unanswered. Why? Was the backpack buried? Why were unfamiliar items inside? Why 30 miles away? Each question pointed toward intention, planning, awareness. The person responsible had not acted impulsively. They had taken steps to manage evidence and distance themselves from the event. As the case moved forward, the backpack became a symbol of everything investigators did not know. It was the one object that bridged the gap between Usha's last known moment and the unknown events that followed. It represented contact, control, and concealment. From that point on, the investigation could no longer focus solely on why Asha left home. It now had to confront a more disturbing reality. Someone had intervened, and they had gone to considerable effort to erase their involvement. The discovery in Burke County did not solve the case, but it changed it forever. Because once Asha's backpack was found buried in the ground, one truth became undeniable. Asha Degree did not disappear on her own. Someone made sure of that. After the discovery of Asha Degree's backpack, the investigation entered a new and more complex phase. The case was no longer defined by uncertainty alone, but by implication. The buried backpack confirmed what investigators had long suspected: Asha had not vanished by accident. Someone else had been involved, and that involvement had been deliberate. Yet identifying who that person was and how they came into Asha's life proved far more difficult than confirming their existence. With no clear suspect, investigators began examining theories more closely. Not as speculation, but as frameworks for understanding behavior. The central question shifted. It was no longer simply what happened to Asha after she left home, but what convinced her to leave in the first place. That question carried profound implications, because it suggested influence rather than force. One of the most persistent theories involved grooming. Investigators considered the possibility that someone had gradually gained Asha's trust over time. Grooming does not require secrecy in the traditional sense. It often occurs in plain sight, through repeated, seemingly harmless interactions. A trusted adult, a familiar face, someone who appeared safe. For a child, trust can be established not through deception alone, but through consistency. This theory aligned closely with Asha's behavior. She did not leave in fear. She walked with purpose. She avoided help from strangers. These details suggested that she believed she was doing what she was supposed to do. That belief did not come from panic or impulse. It came from expectation. Investigators examined every environment Asha moved through regularly: school, church, neighborhood, family gatherings. Any place where she interacted with adults or older children was reviewed carefully. Teachers, coaches, church members, and family acquaintances were all considered. Law enforcement looked for patterns of access, opportunity, and familiarity. Despite extensive review, no individual stood out as an obvious suspect. There were no prior complaints, no reports of inappropriate behavior, no clear warning signs. This absence of evidence was frustrating, but not unusual. Grooming, by its nature, often leaves no visible trail until it is too late. Another theory explored the idea that Asha may have misunderstood or misinterpreted something she was told. Children often take words literally. A casual comment, a joke, or an offhand promise can take on outsized importance in a child's mind. Investigators considered whether Asha believed she was expected somewhere, perhaps for a surprise or a task she felt obligated to complete. This theory raised uncomfortable questions. If Asha believed she was meeting someone, who was that person? And why would a meeting be arranged for the middle of the night, during a storm? Investigators found no evidence that such a plan had been openly discussed, but the absence of evidence did not rule out the possibility of private communication. The contents of the backpack continued to complicate matters. The presence of unfamiliar items suggested that someone else had interacted with Asha's belongings. Whether those items were added before she left home or afterward remained unclear. If they were added later, it meant someone had possession of the backpack for some time. That person may have attempted to disguise its contents or mislead investigators. Investigators also considered whether the unfamiliar items could have been used to manipulate or reward Asha. Children respond strongly to attention, gifts, and perceived privileges. Even small gestures can carry significant weight. The idea that Asha might have been promised something, a gift, an experience, or approval was unsettling but consistent with known grooming behaviors. Another line of inquiry focused on opportunity. Could Asha have encountered someone by chance after entering the woods? While possible, this theory struggled to explain the burial of the backpack and the distance to its discovery site. These actions suggested planning, not spontaneity. They implied that the person involved had time to think, decide, and act deliberately. Law enforcement also examined the possibility of multiple individuals being involved. While there was no direct evidence to support this, investigators acknowledged that some crimes involve more than one person, especially when concealment is involved. The idea that someone might have helped move or hide evidence could not be ruled out entirely. Public speculation grew as the case remained unresolved. Online forums and documentaries proposed various explanations, some grounded in fact, others less so. Investigators monitored these discussions carefully, aware that public interest could generate new leads, but also create misinformation. Law enforcement consistently emphasized the importance of focusing on verified facts. Throughout this period, silence became one of the most defining aspects of the case. No one came forward claiming responsibility. No credible witness emerged with first-hand knowledge of what happened after Asha left the highway. This silence was deeply troubling, but investigators understood it well. Silence can be maintained for years by fear, loyalty, guilt, or the belief that time has erased accountability. The passage of time complicated matters further. Memories faded. Witnesses moved away or passed on. Physical evidence aged. Yet, investigators also knew that time can work in unexpected ways. Relationships change. Loyalties dissolve. People reach moments where silence becomes harder to maintain than truth. This belief sustained the investigation. Detectives continued to appeal to the public, encouraging anyone with information to come forward, no matter how insignificant it might seem. They stressed that details dismissed years earlier could now hold new meaning. Context changes over time. For Asha's family, this phase of the investigation was particularly painful. The discovery of the backpack confirmed their worst fears, but it did not provide answers. They lived in a state of unresolved grief, balancing hope with the growing awareness that the case might never be solved easily. Despite this, they remained committed to keeping Asha's story alive. The community of Shelby continued to feel the impact as well. The case reshaped how people thought about trust and safety. It challenged the assumption that danger always comes from strangers or obvious threats. In Asha's case, the most unsettling possibility was that she may have believed she was safe. Investigators increasingly emphasized this point. Asha's actions did not suggest fear of the person she may have encountered. They suggested trust. That realization reframed the entire case. It shifted focus away from random violence and toward the dynamics of influence and belief. As the investigation moved forward, detectives accepted that progress might come slowly, if at all. The case required patience, persistence, and restraint. It demanded careful attention to detail and a willingness to revisit the same questions repeatedly. Why did Asha leave that night? Who, if anyone, encouraged her to do so? And why has no one spoken? These questions guided every decision, every review, and every public appeal. They represented not only the mystery of Asha's disappearance, but the deeper challenge of understanding how a child could be led quietly and convincingly into danger. The truth, investigators believed, had not disappeared. It had simply been hidden, protected by time, silence, and trust misplaced. And until that silence was broken, the case of Asha Degree would remain unresolved, suspended between what was known and what had yet to be revealed. As the investigation into Asha Degree's disappearance moved beyond its first decade, it entered a phase that few outside law enforcement truly understand. This was no longer a search driven by urgency or public pressure, but by patience. The case had not been solved, but it had not been abandoned either. Instead, it became a long-term commitment, shaped by the belief that time itself could eventually reveal what evidence alone could not. Investigators often describe cold cases as living files. Even when there are no active leads, they are revisited, reviewed, and preserved. In Asha's case, law enforcement agencies continued to maintain her file, ensuring that physical evidence was protected and that tips were documented, even when years passed between meaningful developments. This mattered because advances in technology can transform old evidence into new opportunity. During the early 2000s, forensic science was already evolving, but many of the tools investigators rely on today did not yet exist. DNA analysis, in particular, was far more limited. Small or degraded samples often yielded inconclusive results. In Asha's case, items recovered from the backpack and other early evidence were tested, but nothing definitively identified a suspect. Over time, however, technology improved. As methods became more sensitive, law enforcement revisited preserved evidence, reassessing whether modern techniques could extract new information. This process was slow and careful. It involved re-examining materials that had been handled by numerous people, exposed to the environment, or degraded by time. Even when results were inconclusive, the effort itself reinforced the case's status as active rather than forgotten. At the same time, investigators began re-evaluating information rather than objects. Old tips were pulled from files and read again, this time with years of perspective. Details that once seemed unimportant were reconsidered. A casual remark, a vague description, a name mentioned only once. In cold cases, breakthroughs often occur not because something new is discovered, but because something old is finally understood. Law enforcement also began looking outward, comparing Asha's disappearance to other cases involving children who left voluntarily under unusual circumstances. Patterns emerged across unrelated cases. Children who trusted someone, children who believed they were expected somewhere, children who did not act out of fear. These comparisons reinforced the idea that Asha's actions were shaped by belief rather than panic. This understanding influenced how investigators approached public appeals, rather than focusing solely on what happened after Asha disappeared. They increasingly emphasized the period before she left home. They encouraged people to think back to conversations, interactions, or observations that might once have seemed harmless. They stressed that influence does not always look dangerous in the moment. As years passed, the role of time itself became central to the investigation. Investigators know that silence rarely lasts forever. Beopli, change related shift, fear fades, guilt accumulates. Someone who stayed quiet out of loyalty or fear in 2000 might feel differently 20 years later. This reality has driven countless cold case resolutions. This belief sustained hope in Asha's case. Detectives consistently stated that they believed someone knew more than they had shared. That person might not have committed a crime. They might simply have seen something, heard something, or been told something they did not fully understand at the time. Law enforcement emphasized that even indirect knowledge could matter. Technology also changed how information was shared. The rise of digital databases, online missing persons platforms, and social media expanded the reach of Asha's story far beyond North Carolina. New audiences learned about her disappearance years after it occurred. Each new viewer represented a potential connection, someone who might recognize a detail, a name, or a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. Investigators monitored these developments carefully. While public speculation could be distracting, it also created opportunities. Cold cases are often solved when someone recognizes a piece of information from a different context. A detail from a documentary, a photograph seen online, a description that suddenly aligns with a memory. At the same time, law enforcement remained cautious. They understood that not every tip would be useful and that misinformation could complicate the investigation. They balanced transparency with restraint, releasing enough information to encourage cooperation while withholding details necessary to verify credibility. Internally, the investigation required endurance. Detectives who inherited the case from predecessors took time to familiarize themselves with every detail. They reviewed files, listened to recorded interviews, and spoke with colleagues who had worked the case in earlier years. This continuity was essential. Cold cases often fail not because evidence disappears, but because knowledge is lost through turnover. The emotional weight of the case persisted as well. Investigators described a sense of responsibility that did not diminish with time. The image of a child walking alone into a storm remained vivid. It served as a reminder that unresolved cases represent unfinished obligations not only to families, but to truth itself. For Asha's family, the passage of time brought both resilience and fatigue. Years without answers tested their endurance, yet they continued to engage with law enforcement, to participate in awareness efforts, and to speak about their daughter whenever asked. Their persistence reflected a belief that visibility mattered, even when progress was slow. The broader community also adapted. New generations grew up knowing Asha's name, even if they had not been alive when she disappeared. Her story became part of local memory, a reminder of vulnerability, trust, and the importance of attention to detail. In this way, the case continued to influence behavior long after the initial search ended. As the investigation moved toward its 20th year, law enforcement emphasized one key truth: cold cases do not expire. The absence of resolution does not mean the absence of evidence. It means the evidence has not yet been connected in the right way. Time, investigators believed, could still play a role, not as an ally. Each year increased the likelihood that someone might speak. Each technological advancement expanded the range of what could be tested. Each retelling of Asha's story kept the case alive. This phase of the investigation was defined not by dramatic developments, but by readiness. Files were kept current. Evidence was preserved. Appeals were made thoughtfully. Investigators prepared for the possibility that the next piece of information, however small, could change everything. In the world of cold cases, hope is rarely loud. It is quiet, sustained, and disciplined. It exists not in certainty, but in commitment. Asha Degree's case entered this stage fully, shaped by patience and belief rather than urgency. The truth, investigators maintained, had not disappeared. It was waiting, hidden in memory, circumstance, or conscience. And when it finally surfaced, the years of careful preservation and attention would matter. Until then, the investigation continued, not in headlines or breakthroughs, but in vigilance, in the understanding that time does not erase responsibility, and in the unwavering belief that even after decades, a story left unfinished can still find its ending. As the years passed, Asha Degree's disappearance gradually moved from breaking news into something more abstract, but no less powerful: public memory. The case no longer dominated headlines, yet it never fully faded. Instead, it existed in cycles, resurfacing whenever an anniversary arrived, a new documentary aired, or a renewed appeal was issued by law enforcement. Each resurgence reminded the public that the mystery remained unresolved and that time alone had not delivered answers. Media played a complicated role in this phase of the case. Early coverage had focused on urgency and search efforts. Later, reporting shifted toward analysis, reflection, and unresolved questions. As true crime programming gained popularity, Asha's story reached audiences far beyond North Carolina. People who had never heard her name before were introduced to the images arc of young girl walking into storm, and many were struck by how different her case felt from others. Unlike many disappearances, there was no confirmed crime scene, no definitive moment of violence, and no clear suspect. The mystery rested almost entirely on behavior and belief. That ambiguity made the case haunting, but also difficult to resolve. Media narratives emphasized this tension, presenting Asha's story as one defined by absence rather than evidence. Documentaries, podcasts, and long-form articles revisited the details repeatedly. Each retelling examined the same questions from slightly different angles. Why did Asha leave? Who might she have trusted? Why has no one come forward? These questions remained central, not because they were dramatic, but because they resisted closure. Law enforcement approached media exposure carefully. While public attention could generate leads, it could also distort facts. Investigators remained cautious about what information they released, aware that speculation could quickly overtake reality. They emphasized consistency, repeating verified details and discouraging unfounded theories. Despite these efforts, public speculation inevitably grew. Online forums debated every aspect of the case. Some discussions were thoughtful and restrained, others veered into conjecture. Investigators monitored these conversations, knowing that while many theories were unsupported, occasional insights could emerge from unexpected places. What made Asha has particularly enduring was the way it challenged assumptions. People struggled to understand how a child could leave home voluntarily in the middle of the night. This discomfort kept the case alive in public consciousness. It forced viewers and readers to confront the limits of certainty when interpreting behavior. The role of public memory became especially important for Asha's family. They understood that awareness was not a solution, but it was a form of protection against forgetting. By continuing to speak about Asha, they ensured that her disappearance remained part of the collective conscience. Silence, they believed, was the greatest threat. Community events, memorials, and awareness campaigns helped sustain this visibility. Each anniversary served as both a reminder of loss and a call to action. The family's message remained consistent. Someone knows something, and time does not erase responsibility. For investigators, public memory served a practical purpose as well. Cold cases are often solved when someone recognizes a detail years later. A face, a name, a pattern. Media exposure increased the likelihood of such recognition. It extended the investigation beyond official boundaries, inviting the public to participate in memory. At the same time, the emotional weight of constant exposure was significant. Each retelling reopened wounds for Asha's family. Yet they accepted this cost, believing that keeping the story visible was necessary. Their endurance became part of the case's narrative, a reflection of commitment in the absence of answers. As the case entered its third decade, the absence of resolution became more pronounced. People asked whether the mystery would ever be solved. Investigators responded cautiously. They acknowledged the difficulty, but rejected the idea that time alone determined outcome. History had shown that even decades-old cases could be resolved when the right information surfaced. This belief shaped how law enforcement framed the case publicly. They avoided definitive statements. They emphasized possibility rather than prediction. They stressed that information, no matter how small, could matter. This approach kept the case open not only legally, but psychologically. The public's relationship with the case evolved as well. Early shock gave way to contemplation. Instead of asking what happened, people increasingly asked why it remained unsolved. This shift reflected a deeper engagement with the complexities of investigation, memory, and silence. Usha's story also influenced broader conversations about child safety and trust. Parents reconsidered assumptions about vulnerability. Communities reflected on the idea that danger does not always announce itself. The case challenged the notion that familiarity equals safety, and that children's decisions are always impulsive. Media narratives often highlighted this theme. They framed Usha's disappearance not as a failure of vigilance, but as a reminder of how easily belief can be shaped. This perspective resonated with audiences, contributing to the case's longevity in public discourse. Despite extensive coverage, one fact remained unchanged: no definitive new evidence emerged. The story persisted not because of revelations, but because of unanswered questions. This absence became its own form of presence, shaping how the case was remembered and discussed. Investigators acknowledged this reality privately. They understood that some cases progress through accumulation, rather than discovery. Each retelling, each reminder, each renewed appeal added weight to the possibility that someone would eventually speak. As the years continued, the case became a measure of endurance, not only for the family and investigators, but for the public as well. It asked whether attention could be sustained without resolution, and whether memory alone could contribute to justice. In many ways, Asha Degree's disappearance became less about a single event and more about collective responsibility. It represented the idea that unresolved truths remain active obligations. That silence, even when unintentional, has consequences. The media revival of the case did not bring answers, but it reinforced something equally important. Asha had not been forgotten. Her story continued to be told, examined, and questioned. Each retelling kept open the possibility of resolution. As investigators often say, cold cases do not end. They wait. They persist in files, in memories, and in public awareness. Asha's case exemplified this persistence. It endured not because of certainty, but because of refusal to accept that unanswered questions should simply fade. The weight of those questions remained heavy. Who influenced Asha? Who benefited from her silence? And why has no one come forward after all this time? These questions lingered, shaping every renewed discussion. They ensured that the case remained unfinished, suspended between what is known and what is still hidden. And so, as public memory carried Asha's story forward, the investigation continued in parallel, quiet, patient, and unresolved, waiting for the moment when memory, conscience, and truth might finally converge. As the case of Asha Degree moved deeper into its third decade, investigators increasingly returned to the same pivotal moment, the night she left her home. Not because they lacked imagination or new ideas, but because that night contained the only confirmed sequence of events. Everything that followed was unknown. Every theory, every possibility, had to pass through the narrow gateway of what could be proven about her actions in those early hours. Re-examining that night required discipline. Investigators stripped away speculation and focused on what Asha did. How she did it, what she carried, what she avoided. These details were not dramatic, but they were precise, and precision mattered. Asha left her home quietly. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of panic. She took time to pack a bag. She selected items deliberately. This alone set her case apart from many others involving missing children. Impulsive flight rarely involves preparation. Fear rarely allows for calm decision-making. The timing was also significant. Asha left in the early morning hours, during a storm. Weather conditions were poor. Visibility was limited. This was not a comfortable or inviting environment. Yet she walked steadily, according to witnesses. She did not appear lost. She did not seek help. When a motorist turned around to offer assistance, she fled from the road and into the woods. This reaction became one of the most analyzed moments in the case. Investigators debated its meaning repeatedly. If Asha were afraid of strangers, fleeing made sense. But if she were lost or in danger, avoiding help would be counterintuitive. Her reaction suggested a specific fear, not general distress. Law enforcement increasingly interpreted this behavior as evidence of instruction. Someone may have told her not to speak to strangers, not to accept rides, not to draw attention. These are lessons often taught to children for safety, but in this context, they took on a darker implication. If Asha believed she was supposed to meet someone, avoiding others would align with that belief. This line of reasoning brought investigators back to the concept of influence. Influence does not require force. It requires credibility. For a child, credibility often comes from familiarity or authority. Someone Asha trusted, someone whose instructions she believed were meant to keep her safe. The items she carried reinforced this interpretation. Asha packed clothing and personal belongings, but nothing that suggested fear or escape. She did not take food. She did not take a coat appropriate for the weather. She did not take items that would suggest she planned to be away for long. This suggested expectation rather than uncertainty. Investigators also examined what Asha did not do. She did not leave a note. She did not wake her family. She did not seek reassurance. These omissions mattered. Children who run away often leave emotional signals behind. Asha did not. Her departure was quiet, contained, and purposeful. As years passed, detectives began to consider whether the plan Asha believed in may not have been fully articulated. Children sometimes act on partial understanding. A suggestion, a promise, a vague instruction. The idea that she may have believed she was participating in something temporary, a task, a surprise, a favor remained compelling. This interpretation also aligned with the absence of panic. Asha did not appear to believe she was doing something dangerous. She appeared to believe she was doing something necessary. The challenge, however, was identifying the source of that belief. Investigators reviewed Asha's daily routines repeatedly. School, church, family gatherings, extracurricular activities. They examined who had access to her, who spoke with her regularly, and who might have had the opportunity to communicate privately. No clear candidate emerged. This absence frustrated investigators, but it did not invalidate the theory. Grooming often leaves no obvious trace. It is subtle, incremental, designed to blend into normal interactions. Aschimi went on. Investigators also revisited the early witness sightings with fresh perspective. The motorists who saw Asha walking along the highway provided consistent descriptions. She was alone. She was moving with intent. She reacted predictably to perceived danger. These accounts reinforced the idea that her behavior was internally guided. The scent trail discovered near the shed along Highway 18 remained another focal point. Its abrupt end suggested a transition, possibly into a vehicle. possibly with someone she did not perceive as a threat. This moment became the symbolic dividing line between what could be reconstructed and what could not. Investigators acknowledged that the missing link in the case was not physical evidence, but understanding. Understanding why Asha believed she should leave. Understanding who benefited from her trust. Understanding why no one intervened. The passage of time complicated these questions, but it also clarified priorities. Detectives increasingly focused on behavioral consistency. They compared Asha's actions to known cases involving influence rather than abduction. Patterns emerged. Children who trust do not resist. They comply quietly. They follow instructions. They avoid detection. This framework helped investigators resist the temptation to force conclusions. They did not claim to know what happened. They focused on what Asha's behavior suggested. This restraint became a defining feature of the investigation. Public appeals began to reflect this shift. Law enforcement emphasized belief rather than force. They asked people to consider conversations rather than sightings. They encouraged anyone who remembered unusual interactions involving Asha to come forward, even if those interactions seemed insignificant at the time. This approach acknowledged a difficult truth. The key to the case might not lie in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. A comment made in passing. A suggestion offered casually. A promise that felt harmless. As the investigation continued, detectives also confronted the possibility that the person responsible might not recognize the significance of what they knew. Something. Someone may have noticed a change in behavior. Someone may have dismissed a detail that now carried weight. This realization shaped how investigators framed the case internally. They viewed it not as a puzzle missing pieces, but as a story missing context. The events existed. The meaning had not yet been revealed. Asha's family supported this approach. They spoke often about who Asha was: responsible, thoughtful, eager to please. These traits made her vulnerable to influence. They also made her actions that night more understandable within the framework investigators were building. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more important it became to interpret Asha's actions with respect rather than judgment. Investigators resisted narratives that portrayed her decision as reckless or inexplicable. Instead, they emphasized that children act based on the information they believe is true. This perspective reframed the entire case. It shifted responsibility away from the child and toward the circumstances that shaped her belief. It underscored the idea that understanding what Asha thought she was doing was essential to understanding what happened to her. As the years continued, the night Asha left home remained the most carefully examined period of her life. Every detail was preserved. Every behavior was analyzed. Not because answers were close, but because answers had to begin there. The mystery did not lie in the storm, the road, or the darkness. It lay in belief, in trust, in the quiet conviction of a 9-year-old girl who believed she was doing the right thing. Until that belief is fully understood, the case of Asha Degree remains unresolved. As the investigation into Asha Degree's disappearance stretched across decades, one element became increasingly central to how law enforcement understood the case: silence. Not the silence of a lack of evidence, but the silence of people. The absence of testimony, the absence of confession, the absence of a single, definitive voice willing to explain what happened after Asha left the road that night. Investigators have long distinguished between cases where nothing is known and cases where something is known but not spoken. Asha's case firmly belonged to the latter. Law enforcement consistently stated that they believed someone knew more than they had shared. That belief was not based on speculation, but on experience. Cases involving influence, trust, and Concealment rarely remained completely unknown to everyone involved. Silence, investigators understood, takes many forms. It can be intentional, it can be fearful, it can be protective. It can even be unrecognized. Someone may not realize that what they know matters. A detail dismissed years earlier can become critical when context changes. Ashchimi past detectives increasingly framed the case around this concept. The truth was not necessarily hidden because it was impossible to find, but because it had not yet been spoken in full. This understanding shaped every renewed appeal to the public. Law enforcement emphasized that responsibility does not always rest with the person who committed a crime. Responsibility can also belong to those who witnessed something and said nothing. Those who suspected something and stayed silent. Those who believed time would erase the need to speak. In Asha's case, investigators believed that silence had become layered. Initial silence may have been driven by fear or loyalty. Over time, that silence hardened into habit. Years passed. Lives changed. The moment to speak felt increasingly distant. Yet silence did not erase knowledge. It only buried it. This dynamic made the case uniquely difficult. Without a confession or a cooperating witness, investigators were forced to rely on inference, behavior, and probability. They built frameworks rather than conclusions. They focused on what Asha's actions suggested and what subsequent concealment implied. The buried backpack remained a central symbol of this silence. It represented a conscious decision to hide evidence. Someone chose not to discard it openly. Someone chose to bury it 30 miles away, in a place unlikely to be discovered quickly. That choice suggested awareness. It suggested responsibility. Investigators also considered whether silence extended beyond a single individual. Crimes involving children often create ripple effects. Someone may have helped indirectly. Someone may have been told a partial truth. Someone may have suspected something was wrong but chose not to ask questions. These possibilities expanded the scope of responsibility without diluting it. Law enforcement did not claim to know how many people were involved. They emphasized instead that silence can be shared, even unintentionally. As years passed, detectives revisited earlier interviews, paying close attention not just to what was said, but to how it was said. Hesitation, deflection, inconsistency. These elements mattered. They did not prove guilt, but they suggested discomfort. The challenge was that discomfort alone is not evidence. Investigators needed corroboration. They needed a detail that aligned with known facts. They needed something that could be verified independently. This requirement kept the case from moving forward, but it also protected its integrity. Public appeals increasingly reflected this careful balance. Law enforcement avoided accusatory language. They did not name suspects publicly. They focused instead on encouragement. They appealed to conscience rather than fear. They reminded the public that speaking now was not the same as speaking then. Circumstances had changed. Protections existed. The goal was understanding, not punishment for silence alone. This approach recognized a hard truth. People are more likely to speak when they feel safe. Fear of retaliation, legal consequences, or social judgment can keep people quiet for decades. Investigators worked to remove those barriers where possible. Asha's family echoed this message. They spoke openly about forgiveness, understanding, and the importance of truth. Their focus remained on answers, rather than retribution. This stance was not born of naivety, but of endurance. They understood that the only path to resolution ran through honesty. The weight of unanswered questions continued to shape the case. Why has no one come forward? Why has no confession emerged? Why has silence endured for so long? investigators offered no simple answers. They acknowledged that silence can survive because it feels easier than truth. Speaking can disrupt lives, relationships, and self-image. Remaining silent allows people to maintain the illusion that time has resolved what it has not. Yet law enforcement remained firm in one belief: silence is not permanent. It may endure for years, but it rarely survives indefinitely. What once felt impossible becomes necessary. This belief sustained the investigation. Detectives continued to wait, not passively, but attentively. They maintained readiness for the moment when silence might break. They preserved evidence. They kept files updated. They remained available. The case also forced investigators to confront broader questions about justice. What does justice look like when evidence is limited and time has passed? Is truth still valuable even if accountability is uncertain? These questions shaped how law enforcement framed the case internally. For Asha's family, silence represented both pain and hope. Pain because it delayed closure. Hope because silence implied that someone knew the truth. If the truth existed, it could still emerge. The community carried this weight as well. Asha's disappearance remained a reminder that unresolved cases do not fade quietly. They persist in memory, shaping how people think about trust, responsibility, and vigilance. As the years continued, the case became less about discovering a dramatic revelation and more about waiting for honesty. Investigators understood that the missing piece might not be physical evidence, but a human decision. Someone deciding that silence was no longer acceptable. Someone deciding that truth mattered more than comfort. Someone deciding to speak. Until that decision is made, the case remains open not only legally, but morally. The responsibility to speak does not expire with time. Knowledge does not become harmless because it is old. Asha Degree's story remains suspended in this space, between what is known and what is withheld, between memory and confession, between silence and truth. The investigation continues to hold space for that truth, waiting patiently for the moment when silence gives way. Because in cases like this, resolution does not arrive through force. It arrives through choice. And that choice, investigators believe, still lies ahead. As the years continue to pass, the disappearance of Asha Degree occupies a space that few cases ever reach. It is no longer defined solely by investigation, nor solely by memory. It exists somewhere in between. A case that remains open not because of constant activity, but because it has never been resolved. A story that resists closure not through complexity alone, but through the absence of one final truth. For law enforcement, the case represents an enduring responsibility. Investigators have been careful not to declare defeat, not to allow the passage of time to rewrite the meaning of what happened. Asha's file remains active. Her name remains in databases. Her case remains part of institutional memory. This persistence reflects an understanding that justice does not operate on a schedule. Cold cases are often misunderstood as forgotten cases. In reality, they are cases waiting for the right moment, waiting for a shift in circumstance, waiting for someone to decide that silence is no longer sustainable. Asha's case has been held in this state deliberately, protected from being closed simply because answers are difficult. Over time, investigators have come to accept that resolution may not look like a dramatic confession or a courtroom verdict. It may arrive quietly, a piece of information shared privately, a memory finally revisited, a detail passed on without fanfare. These moments rarely announce themselves as breakthroughs, but they matter nonetheless. The family has learned to live with this uncertainty in a way few people ever have to. They have endured years without answers, birthdays without presents, milestones without meaning. Yet they continue to speak of Asha not as a mystery, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a child who mattered long before she disappeared. Their advocacy has never been about spectacle. It has been about presence. Keeping Asha visible, keeping her story from fading into abstraction. This effort has ensured that her disappearance remains human rather than historical. Asha is not remembered as a case number, but as a girl whose life was interrupted. The community surrounding the case has also evolved. People who once followed the investigation closely have grown older. New generations have learned Asha's name through documentaries, articles, and online discussions. Each retelling introduces her story to someone new, expanding the circle of awareness. This expansion matters. Awareness does not solve cases on its own, but it increases the chance that the right person will recognize something familiar, a name, a detail, a behavior. Cold cases are often resolved not through evidence alone, but through recognition. As the case stands today, investigators remain cautious, but not pessimistic. They do not claim certainty. They do not promise resolution. Instead, they emphasize possibility. The possibility that someone will speak. The possibility that context will change. The possibility that truth will surface when it is least expected. This approach reflects experience rather than optimism. Law enforcement has seen cases solved after decades of silence. They have seen individuals come forward late in life. They have seen secrets revealed after relationships ended, after fears faded, after conscience demanded relief. Asha's case fits the pattern of those stories, even if its ending has not yet arrived. It carries the same markers. Intentional behavior, concealment, silence. These elements suggest not randomness, but knowledge withheld. The unanswered questions remain heavy. What convinced Asha to leave that night? Who benefited from her trust? Why was her backpack buried? And why has no one yet told the full story? These questions do not diminish with time. They sharpen. They gain weight as years pass without explanation. They transform the case from a mystery into a moral reckoning. Because beyond investigation lies accountability. Not only legal accountability, but human accountability. The responsibility to speak when silence causes harm. The responsibility to acknowledge what is known, even when it is uncomfortable. Asha's disappearance has become a reminder of how fragile trust can be, of how belief can shape behavior, of how easily a child's sense of safety can be exploited. These lessons extend beyond one case. They echo in conversations about protection, communication, and vigilance. The story also challenges assumptions about closure. Closure is often imagined as a definitive answer. In reality, closure can take many forms. It can be understanding. It can be acknowledgement. It can be truth, even without punishment. For Asha's family, closure has never meant forgetting. It has meant knowing what happened, knowing why, knowing that their daughter's story is complete, even if it ends in sorrow. Until that knowledge exists, the story remains unfinished. Investigators continue to wait, not because they lack direction, but because the case requires patience. They understand that the missing piece is not something they can manufacture. It must be offered. It must be spoken. The public, too, plays a role by remembering Asha, by sharing her story responsibly, by resisting sensationalism, by understanding that behind every unresolved case is a real person and a real family. Asha Degree's disappearance endures because it occupies a space that cannot be ignored. It is not simply about a child who vanished, but about the unanswered forces that shaped her final known. Decision It is about trust misplaced and truth withheld. The road she walked that night no longer holds her footprints. The storm has long passed. The darkness has lifted. But the question remains. Somewhere, someone knows what happened after Asha stepped off that road. And until that knowledge is brought into the light, her story remains open, not forgotten. Not closed. Waiting. As of today, the disappearance of Asha Degree remains an open and active case. No arrests have been made, and no one has been charged. Investigators now consider the case a homicide investigation, despite the absence of recovered remains. Law enforcement continues to review evidence and pursue leads, more than 2 decades later.